does it affect you when, say, I'm Australian, our Foreign Minister went to Beijing 2 weeks ago and said very supportive comments for Tibet, which would have been very uplifting. But on his personal blog, he says the exact opposite. How does that affect the confidence of Tibetans and the Tibetan Parliament working with foreign countries?
Oh, that's strange in the sense sometimes people make some worst statements in an official capacity while personal level they support it, right? Right now it's opposite, I guess. So personal blog, he says that complete opposite of it.
Yes, he called His Holiness a cunning monk and said that it's not in Australia's interest to go down this line. He has modified the blog a number of times since we harangued him in 2010. And the blog has been written, but it's still unbending. He runs, the Foreign Minister was responsible for running large conferences to increase Chinese investment in Australia, Chinese immigration to Australia, etc., etc. So he's obviously got a monetary interest in all of this. He's not my choice of foreign minister, and perhaps when the Australian government changes, that's going to be said. But how does it affect Tibetan morale when this sort of duplicity happens?
Frankly, at a personal level, I'm quite used to it. So it doesn't mind or pull me back working towards what I'm doing right now. So it doesn't surprise or sometimes affect me in my work. As far as there are always majority of the global community, not excluding the governments, there have been huge support for the His Holiness vision of having this democratic, autonomous, as we call it, middle way path to have the genuine autonomy in Tibet. And this has been supported by almost so many people. And that's something that I take in rather than taking those small issues to bog me down.
Can I ask you just one second question? On the bigger picture, China has never been held accountable for nearly 80 million deaths since World War II. Is there any way of the United Nations calling for accountability for this party that is currently being strengthened? I mean, I realise human rights abuses and secret human rights abuses and corruptions exist everywhere, all over the world. But, this is a very blatant piece of history, but there's never been any accountability for this?
Unfortunately, or technically, probably not. But there is this complaint procedure also in the UN system where if you can prove a consistent pattern of gross human rights violation, you can be held accountable. And there's a working group on communication, working group on situation, it goes up to the UN General Assembly, Human Rights Council. That's one thing. And another is, there's another theory that's coming up more recently, is responsibility to protect. It's a notion that, again, it has to be passed unanimous by the UN Security, permanent member of the Security Council, where if there's a gross human rights violation, or gross in the sense that there's a genocide, ethnic cleansing, crime against humanity, then you have, the other country has the responsibility to protect those people and intervene. So that's something, that new concept is coming up, but it's still at the very initial stage. And something like this was, I don't know whether you can propose this in that R2P, we call it, as responsibility to protect in Libya, but in Libyan case is a bit different. But this theory is coming up. So we have seen in the past the failure of preventing genocide in Rwanda, where there's enough evidence of it. So the global community at the larger level have thought about it as a responsibility to protect principle, but it still is a very initial stage. But other than that, I don't see any mechanism, or you can file a case in International Criminal Court or ICJ. But ICJ's case, you have a state has to sponsor a case. So ICC you can do so, but still it's very complicated. And China is not a member of ICC in the sense International Criminal Court. China is not a member, so it's very difficult. So
I think China does whatever they want concerning Tibet. Last year, Austria we invited the Dalai Lama for a speech, and also the Norwegians did. So we were both forbidden to enter Tibet out from Nepal, for instance, last year, because we invited the Dalai Lama and nobody could do anything. See, I did what they want.
That's something now. global community is also sometimes begin to getting used to it, but at the same time it's important never to get used to these things, and especially in European countries, the people's role in the changing the government policy, not exactly the foreign policy, but at least to receive His Holiness, the people does have a huge say in the, I see, especially in European countries and Australia.
I just wanted to go back on Kerry's point and what I was trying to get at a minute ago. It's like you said, there is an accountability. But my concern is that a lot of effort may be put into raising the issues of Tibet for this upcoming review. And even though there may be glaring human rights abuses with regard to Tibet and maybe some other minorities, at the end of the day, even those 47 countries on the Human Rights Councils can raise their objections, but in the end of the day, what really can be done? I think historically the UN has been seen to have no teeth in making particularly big countries accountable, where they have economic sway and political sway like China. So even though the effort might go into raising those issues, really at the end of the day, what can be done to be held China accountable?
Unlike during the Tiananmen killings, when they were having arms embargo and economic sanctions, that's not going to happen at all. But then one thing that can happen is passing resolutions, because sometimes at the international fora, it is very important to, China's might have this economic might, but at the same time they need respect from the global community. That's evident from what they have been doing in the UN system. They have been actively participating. They have been, especially the Human Rights Council. So passing if one can able to pass a resolution against China on those matters, that's a huge setback for China in the global, So that's something realistically, possible. And the other thing is, one thing is that that Tibet issue is rarely being raised in Human Rights Council, is because China has been very active in the UN Human Rights Council participation. They have a huge delegation, present report. So sometimes it's because if one country wants to raise an issue, they have to have this will or sincerity. But sometimes it's just for the sake of it they raise it, and so China's come with this huge replies. So it's very difficult to raise issue of Tibet, but it's also possible also. Yep.
It's been, so the international pressure or international interference, it's been the major topic here, but you mentioned something about national pressure, so internal pressure from the Chinese people. In what shape do you see this? Do you see this coming, and do you see this as a possible solution?
Yeah, that's what, when at the end of the presentation, it's written, as I've stated, unless if there is a change in world economic order, and there is a change inside China. Now, China has been focusing a lot on economic development and elevating millions of Chinese from poverty, and at the same time they have to know that reality that people have access to information. This is something that China fears most, but at the same time this is something that getting very rapidly growing inside China. So because when I was in US, I have lots of Chinese students, not friends but Chinese students, but I try to talk to them, and they have this blanket of coverage of news agencies or news coverage inside China. So when they come out, as one of you raised about Chinese students being in the US, so many number of Chinese students increasing. So that's also one window of opportunity, in the sense that lots of informations are coming in. Lots of people are seeing beyond what the Communist Party is serving them. So this is something that because there's huge protests going inside China that no one knows. So once this goes on as a larger scale, so I think there is a chance in changing the situations inside China, also in other ethnic minority areas.
Just to continue with that, last year, just on a personal note, I was travelling around Amdo and Kam area by myself, and I'd been here beforehand, and I had a blog, and I had something about self-immolation, something about Dalai Lama, and the whole time I was in China, my blog was was blocked. I mean, their filters are so good that anything that's related to a Tibetan issue will be blocked. And if we think about the number of Chinese who may go out as international students to the US or Australia or Europe, it's only a small percentage. And so their impact once they go back, if they go back, is going to be so limited. So even though we have the internet, etc., the educated Chinese people I spoke to, they weren't aware of what was going on in Tibet.
Yeah, that's also true. I just citing one example of that.
Yeah.
Otherwise, more so it's happening inside China. They have access to internet. I know, but there's restricted. But still, you can still overcome the censor. If there are so many Chinese dissidents who do that, and at the same time, it's also important to realize that China is still developing. There are lots of middle class people. They don't care about what's going at the top level. Unless you're educated, you are just well off, then they have this interest about global peace, human rights of other ethnic minorities. Unless those middle class comes up, majority of them comes up, and then they have the luxury to, sometimes to care about other people, then sometimes I think will change dramatically. Because there's lots of middle class people who has been striving, and there's this huge economic boom, booming inside China, and they're all going after it. So once they reach some certain level and then realize, then they care about peace, non-violence, human rights, then something would change, I guess. But this is, I think, very possible.
Just in the interest of balance, was it breaking the United Nations statutes or the Universal Declaration of Human Rights to assassinate Obama, because America is the largest supporter of Tibet? So Obama had no trial, of course, etc., etc. Osama bin Laden, sorry, not Obama. Osama. Sorry, brain gap. But does this influence how China works on the human rights level?
Sorry.
Does this sort of event affect how China sees the United Nations?
Sometimes it's very, disturbing to see, because there's also, even the killing of Osama has been debated among the human rights activists, because whether he was armed or not, whether the US armies have security forces can arrest him or not. So there's this big question that is going on. And apart from that, the checking of mobile phones or spying on, that's something that is very discouraging, or sometimes, because you look up to some people which liberty, human rights, equality, then personal freedom of expression, in European countries and US, then again you suppress those individual liberties. Then that's you give brownie points to the Chinese to do the same thing. Then now that's something, as a human rights researcher here, as a Tibetan human rights researcher, I follow that very closely, in the sense that that's not I wished it happened, And also, because I didn't touch much on the Tibet issue, because I wanted to make it more China specific, so that because since you're all in Damsa, you've been hearing a lot of the Tibetan issue from everyone, so that's why I thought it would be good to just give overview of China's engagement towards Tibet. UN.
Alright, so before we conclude, I would like, on behalf of Museum Section, Department of Information and International Relations, I would like to thank Mr. Namgyal, Head of UN, EU and Human Rights Desk in Department of Information and International Relations, for coming here and giving this presentation and sharing your valuable information with us. And I also would like to thank each and every one of you for coming here and participating in this talk session and making this a very interactive session. And as a token of appreciation, I would like to present to him a white scarf. And we have light refreshment right there, so one can have.
Thank you.
Thank you so
Thank you.
much.